All right, welcome back to another web development podcast where we help aspiring developers get jobs and junior developers grow. So a lot of you have asked me, how do I get into DevOps? So I've known a few people in DevOps. I'm going to be honest, a few people that I have known that kind of keep to themselves. It was a little trickier trying to get people to come onto this podcast for DevOps, but I know from experience, when I start having a conversation and asking for advice, especially when building out the pipeline, because I did have a lot of questions, probably bugged too many people. But I feel like DevOps in general, when someone wants to listen to them, they have a lot of great advice to give. And they usually have quite a bit of experience to back it up. But yeah, I'm going to be learning quite a bit on this podcast with you today. But I invited on someone that's been in this field for a little while. David, thanks so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Don.
Absolutely. So I guess kind of just do a quick intro of your experience. What have you been doing in DevOps?
So I've been in the field for 7 years now. I lucked out. The guy who ended up becoming my best friend and current teammate is the guy who also sort of like pulled me onto the DevOps team at my first gig. So yeah, I've been doing it for about 7 years. My first gig lasted for 3 years, and that was at a company called Relativity. And I was on a team of probably 14 people that were doing DevOps. So it was the type of thing where you have a relatively narrow scope of responsibilities compared to my next gig, where I was the only person doing DevOps at a company that had about 30 engineers. And so they brought me on they already had deployment pipelines and tooling set up to get stuff into Heroku. And so they had a staging environment, a production environment, and then a sandbox environment, and also a UAT environment. Basically, they had environments that would get really messy, and they wanted me to come in and build out tools to make the development process easier. And that's what I focused on for about like two and a half years there. And then I am now currently working at a company called The Network, no vowels in network. It's based out of LA. It's basically QVC for millennials. And if my CEO is listening, I'm so sorry for describing it like that. And appreciate I was brought on. I was brought on for similar reasons to build out development tooling, but also I've ended up just shifting. I've built out me and my team have built out the entirety of the development, production, and staging infrastructure and all the workflows to move things around in there. So it's been a nice progression. I've really, honestly, been pretty fortunate with the opportunities afforded to me.
That's good to hear. So a couple things we're going to explore today are what it's like, right? And I think it was even you that shared with me, like DevOps can really have a variety of responsibilities depending on what company you work at. But we're also going to be exploring how do you get into DevOps? Because that's also a really important question. But I'm going to start off with just a couple of questions out of curiosity. You mentioned you came into a job, they had Heroku. Heroku, first of all, I love Heroku. I think it's amazing for a lot of developers to just get an app up and running, and a lot of coding boot camps will encourage their students to set something up with Heroku. But when I hear that, it almost makes it so easy that I'm surprised to hear there was like a role where you would manage that. Did you actually manage the Heroku pipeline, or did you advance it to something else?
So that's a good point. So at that company, the thing that really rules about Heroku is that it is so easy to use, and it really makes it so that you don't need to have like someone managing it directly. And I'm a really big fan of like one of the primary theoretical ideals in DevOps is that it is a combination. It enables developers to do operations, and as far as I'm concerned, managing, staging, and production is operations. And so I want the developers to do that. So fortunately, I was like, hey guys, y'all have all been running all the Heroku stuff this entire time before I got here. Keep doing it. I mean, y'all are doing a great job. Like, the site almost never goes down. They had clean workflows for getting things into staging and production. So I just left Heroku as it was and then built all of the stuff to enable them to do development more easily prior to it getting to staging into Heroku. or staging and production. So like for the main project that I worked on was that like if someone creates a branch in GitHub, we had maybe 30 different repos and we had a Slack command, and you would run at Hydra. I named our Slack bot Hydra because I thought it was funny the idea that you chop one bug off and you introduce like 4 more.
I like it.
So you would say at Hydra QA stack, which would create a QA quality assurance stack. You would pass in the branch name, and it would look through. It would deploy the whole thing, but for every repo that had that branch name, it would use that branch and then deploy our stack into what's called an ephemeral environment. And then developers could do work inside of that, make sure that all their features work, and then destroy that, and then take those code changes and put it into staging. So yeah, that's sort of what I've worked on, was everything before staging and production.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So whereas the old workflow would be that like they would get stuff into UAT, user acceptance testing, then they would run a bunch of tests in there or manually QA things. That would have the feedback loop of around like an hour and a half, and you could only have one person working in there at a time, which, you know, it's the type of thing where it's like with Heroku, like when you only have 5 developers, that's fine. When you're a single developer working on your own, Heroku rules because it just takes, DevOps is all about efficient laziness. And so, you know, we had reached the point where we had 30 developers and they were constantly stepping on each other's toes. So we needed the ability to have multiple environments that they could be working in, and then more automated tests. We eventually got that feedback loop from like an hour and a half or 2 hours down to about 10 minutes for them to write new code and then make sure it works. Please, sorry, I cut you off though, please.
No, that's
I'll tab really quick because I'm getting messaged on Slack and I want to be able to pay attention.
Sounds good. That's interesting. Okay, so I don't want to jump into this too quickly. So that was your second position, because I do have some questions about like what you should learn specifically, but I do want to hold off on that. So the second position, it sounds like you essentially had more room to just figure out like some of the holes of that pipeline. You figured out it was before the staging process for your second company. And then you allowed multiple views on that, where Heroku actually provided a limitation for that company. So, okay. So when I hear DevOps and I hear DevOps talk about their job and their responsibilities, a lot of times it's just figuring out, like you said, that's really interesting, what part of the process is kind of broken, and what can I do to make developers' lives easier, and trying to build those environments to be able to do that. That's essentially a slightly common thing that I hear. But I guess with your current job now, I guess I want to get more of a picture. How is it different than the Heroku job?
Yeah, very good question. So like so at my previous job, we were using Heroku for staging and production, and then we were using Kubernetes in AWS for our development infrastructure. So I wasn't responsible. I didn't design anything in Heroku. I was just responsible for the dev stuff. Whereas for this company, I've been fortunate enough that they were just like, yeah, run with it, go crazy. And I got the dev environment set up. But have you talked before on this about the tool Terraform?
No, but I've heard of it.
So Terraform is an incredible tool. I would recommend, if people want to start playing around with DevOps, like you need to learn Terraform, at the very least, the very basics. It's incredible because it's a declarative programming language. You essentially just state, here are the things that I want to create. I want to create this server. I want to create this network connection. I want to create this firewall, yada, yada, yada. And we have a few thousand lines of code that defines sort of like a generic Kubernetes deployment with all of the supporting services and everything that we need to support our environment, be it staging, production, or dev, or whatever. And then we have like a configuration file that we can pass in there to configure it to be deployed to dev, staging, or production. So the main thing that I focused on with this company is that I wanted to write code to define all of our infrastructure. and also have it defined in such a way that our development infrastructure is as close to identical as our staging or production infrastructure. The primary reason behind that is that like there's two primary reasons. One of them is it makes it way easier for developers to do that work. And it's also like way easy. Like right now we're rolling out some changes to the way that we manage our DNS addresses. So we push those out to the dev infrastructure and leave that for a week just to catch any weirdness. And then because everything is defined exactly the same, we just propagate that up to staging and production. And then also I'm very lazy. I don't want to wake up in the middle of the night if like something is broken in production. I didn't write that code. And I'm also not the person that is going to know best how to fix it. So by using the same thing in dev and forcing and encouraging and empowering developers to use the tools to understand how to manipulate their environments in dev and fix issues in dev, they then implicitly learn how to do things in staging and production. So well, actually, I did have to step in on some production issues about a week or so ago, but it had been like 3 or 4 months since the previous time that I had to do that because, people just learn how to use these different environments. A long-winded answer to a relatively quick question, but hopefully that covers it.
No, that's super helpful. Gives me definitely more of an in-depth picture. And I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like an ultimate goal of DevOps is to try to create enough automation and create enough comfort for developers and even just ownership and resourcefulness where they can figure it out so you don't get pulled into it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. I like that.
That's the selfish thing of it is, us DevOps engineers, we don't want to be pulled into that stuff. But then, there's also the realistic thing, which is that like developers don't want to have to come to us to fix things. Like if you are freaking out because, your code is broken, you don't want to have to go through someone else. And if you know how to fix it, it rules. Yeah.
I remember my first job as a developer. It was so hard to distinguish what was buggy, like what was actually buggy about the website if we were having an issue. Was it the code? Was it the back-end code, front-end code, DevOps? And we had a really good DevOps person. It was never a DevOps issue. It was never an environment issue like that, which is awesome. Like that made it much easier. And I think, a lot of developers are a little less comfortable with the command line and going a little bit deeper in that direction and even just setting up the pipeline environment. So first of all, thank you for making that easy. So with that third job, with the second and third, it sounds like you had some freedom to establish a lot of this automation and make it as easy as possible for developers. What was your first job like? You said you were very focused narrowly in that job.
Yeah. So that was much more, that was a company that had, whereas this company that I'm working at now and my previous one, all of their stuff was running in the cloud. My first company was a mixture of some stuff running on the cloud and then some stuff running inside of data centers that customers owned. And so the practices around that are quite different. We had like a 2 or 3 week release cadence, whereas you would only push out changes every 2 or 3 weeks, whereas at my previous company, we were pushing out 10 changes a day. It was much, much, much more narrow. My first project actually, which was kind of nuts for like a first project, was we were moving the whole company from Mercurial, like the version control system, over to Git. Just because like Git is industry standard. And I think it's better. Git's my favorite piece of software. So one of my first projects was building some tools to convert repos, working with individual teams to convert repos and start doing trial runs and proofs of concept, and then propagating those changes to the rest of the company, and also designing educational like materials and doing like talks with. I had every single developer. I was in my first I think I was maybe in my 3rd month in my career. And I had every single developer across 250 developers come into a classroom where I was teaching people the basics of how to use Git. And let me tell you, it's really awkward to be there in front of someone and not know how to close out a VI. When you have guys who are just like too cool for school, like mid-30s lead architects or whatever. it was very embarrassing, but also really, it was cool. It was really, really cool. Yeah.
That's an interesting experience. Okay. Mm-hmm.
So it was lots of projects like that. I mean, another one that I did, I wrote the logic to create version numbers or like to iterate version numbers there. So there was a while where every version number came from this guy, at least at my company. And then there was another one where, and this was like mine. It was even more boring to work on than it is to hear described. But the ironing out the way that we referenced other pieces of code. We had like 6 different solutions. We had like 550 something different project files across like 3 different languages. We have 2 versions of Node.js running in there, and people didn't have any consistent way of referencing code. So we had to write code to do graph theory style analysis on how everyone is referencing code, build rules to analyze that, and then make it so that whenever someone pushed code, if they didn't follow those rules, it would break their build and prevent them from being able to merge that code.
What do you mean referencing code?
So like, if you are trying to do something more advanced with your code, then like, if you don't want to have to write out, like if you're trying to interact with GitHub, or like if you're trying to calculate the square root of a number, you don't want to have to rewrite the code to calculate that square root or interact with GitHub every single time you want to do that. So you'll define your code to do that thing in a file, and then in other places where you want to do that thing, these other places will point to that file and then use the function defined in that file. So instead of writing my square root function all over the place, I'll just reference the one that I already wrote over here. People were doing that in an inconsistent way, which is insane.
Yeah. So you can do, so maybe this is my ignorance. You can do that with multiple languages?
I guess. I think that it was all Visual Basic and C++ and C# that would the outputs of those things would be, I don't know if they were referencing cross language, but even within C#, there was no consistency to how they were referencing things, which is such a niche thing. So I would say that that project is a really good indicator of the types of things that you could potentially expect to be doing at a large company, because once you get to the point of having, if you only have 10, 20, 30 engineers, it doesn't really matter if you're referencing things inconsistently. It's going to suck down the road, but at least at this point in time, it doesn't really matter. When you have 250 engineers and 10 million lines of code, then it really starts to matter, because your build doesn't work unless you run the build in Visual Studio and then on your command line and then Visual Studio again. And you start getting weird quirks like that just make it harder and harder for development to be done.
That was actually a focus of ours with my second company. We had a team of 12 engineers, and that was actually really important to us then. I almost wouldn't want to work in an environment where a lot of people are writing very similar functions that kind of just do the same thing. That seems chaotic. So good for you.
Yeah. It's definitely something that you want to squash in the bud or whatever, if you can.
Okay. Interesting. So definitely different projects, somewhat unique. I didn't think even DevOps would focus on creating a lot of those conventions or reusable functions or organizing that in general. That's interesting. I kind of want to get a feel for what you love about the job and what you hate. Let's start with what you love.
It's a really, I'm definitely the type of person that will get really passionate and into something for a month or 2 at a time, and then be bored with it it'll take a day or 2 for me to become immensely bored with it. And I really like DevOps because there's always so much to do. And when you do, a lot of the things that you can do can really make a big difference in the life of the developers at the company. And my job is to make all of my coworkers' lives easier, which is a really satisfying thing to do. And yeah, there's just always interesting things to be working on. And there are so many things that you have to consider beyond you have to consider, how am I going to write documentation for this? How is this going to be maintained in the long run? When I'm building workflows, I just got out of an issue where one of our earlier today, one of our senior developers was using the wrong command to try to deploy to production, because the deploy to staging is deploy staging, and then the deploy to production is promote staging. Because like, to me, in my mind, I thought that distinction makes sense, but it only makes sense because that's the model that I have in my brain. And so it's a really interesting thing of like figuring out not only how do I build these things, but also how do I design the UX so that people can effectively use these tools that I'm building. So it's a lot of interesting challenges.
So you're focused on the UX of your development team.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
one
interesting.
of my biggest concerns. Yeah. And it's the type of thing where like I was even talking with the other people on my team right before this, where it's like, it's an interesting thing because like, it's kind of frustrating to see your tools get used wrong, especially if you've written documentation and if you explained how to use them and all this stuff. But like the lead engineer at my first company, the lead DevOps engineer at my first company, I built some tools like I had mentioned earlier to help with the transition from Mercurial to Git. And those tools weren't being used correctly, and people were coming to us with questions that I had already answered 100 times before. I was complaining to this lead engineer, and I was like, dude, Adam, this sucks. Why don't these developers pay attention and use my tools right? I've written all these great tools. I've written this great documentation. He's like, David, hold on. All these people are professionals that have been working in this industry for a long time. They're all smart people. If you're building a tool and everyone is using it wrong, you built the tool wrong. And like, it makes so much sense. And, like, it kind of sucks that this tool isn't getting used right, but also people have so many things that they need to be focusing on. So if the tool is getting used wrong consistently, then I need to improve the tool. And like, it's an interesting thing of like, those challenges. I really dig it.
If it makes you feel better, the number of conversations developers have had, I built this feature for these users. It solves their problem. Why aren't they using it? Right? They're still complaining that it's not solved. So that just kind of flows down the pipeline.
Complaint. Yeah. You go onto the on-ramp to get on the highway and you see the ramp meter and people are zooming right by, not knowing that it's going to make their lives better for everyone if they don't. But yeah, there's only so much that you can do.
That's true.
Battles. Yeah. I
like that. So what do you hate or dislike?
That people don't read my documentation and use all my tools wrong. I would say a lot of this stuff is pretty cutting edge, or at least like a lot of this stuff is new. And so the tools are constantly changing. We're running into some issues now where all of our laptops are moving from where we all use MacBooks, and Apple has switched from using Intel CPUs to ARM CPUs, their own internal silicon, and that's a different architecture. And some of the Terraform things that we use aren't compiled for ARM. Ooh. So now we have to spin up an EC2 instance that has Intel on. And like, I'm using a bunch of like niche, very specific technical terms, but I'm doing so to illustrate that like, that's the very frustrating thing is you run into all of these really weird edge cases, and you will spend, I have spent literal weeks of my life trying to figure out, and I'm sure, this is something that exists for all developers, bad documentation and whatnot. But yeah, it's really frustrating when you're trying to write some Terraform and figure out, just where you need the escapes and the quotes and the right dollar signs in the right places. And like, it takes 20 minutes to apply because you thought you were being so clever back when you started at this job and you threw everything into the same Terraform repo. But now it takes 20 minutes to update it because, hey, guess what? Everything's in the same Terraform repo. So it needs to scan through everything. So it's just bad documentation, using new tools, having all these cool ideas of things that you want to do, and then things not really working right. Like we have this one tool called Telepresence that we use to have developers connect their machines to the Kubernetes clusters to make it easier for them to do development. It is an incredible tool that has really let us do some like really, really, really cool stuff. But that tool, the network connection drops randomly, and it doesn't provide any error logs as to why it does it. There aren't any error logs on the client, on the user's computer. There aren't any error logs on the frigging server. It just dies sometimes, but it doesn't do it when I'm doing it just on my own on my server. So, it's the type of thing where we've been struggling with this thing for 4 months, and we don't know. We've tried out all these different solutions, but there's just no clear answers. So you get in here and you get a lot of things where you don't have any clear answers.
That can be frustrating.
Yeah.
When you so you were essentially dealing with the actual CPU changes, architecture changes, is that more of all of a sudden a lot of your tools aren't optimized for that architecture, or just flat out don't work?
It literally does not work. It literally will not run on. Yeah, thankfully, there's only one chunk of infrastructure that needs to be deployed from our machines, because like this is a danger. If you are having mission critical infrastructure that has to be deployed from someone's machine, well, what if you need to lay that person off? What if they get hit by a bus? What if their machine, what if they go down to the ocean and think that laptop frisbee is a fun thing to do? Like, you don't want that to happen. So thankfully there's only one thing, but it also is dangerous because I'm the only one on my team that has an x86 processor. So I'm the only one that can do those things. And yeah, that's just like spooky. It's very spooky.
Very spooky. Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess for people that kind of want to identify different types of dev positions, this is a general question. You can help me narrow it. It sounds like there are different types of dev positions, right? I guess we'll do this. How can someone identify that DevOps is for them? What kind of things should they be playing around with and get excited about? And what kind of positions would that lead into?
I think that you need to have like already. Well, let me start by breaking it sort of down into like two different major categories of DevOps that I would consider, like, because companies use this term all over the place, and really what a DevOps position is to a company, it differs quite a bit. So you'll have DevOps positions at large companies where you're working on the more narrow stuff, and like way more specific things, and you're not architecting development pipelines, or maybe not even necessarily creating workflows, but just updating and bug fixing the workflows. And then you'll have DevOps positions where, yeah, you are working in a smaller company and you're building a much, much, much wider range of things. I would say for the former, I would say that in general for DevOps, you just have to have a passion for being efficiently lazy or effectively lazy. Like, it really is just about identifying the biggest issues and the places where with the least effort you can make life easier for people, or make it easier to do something, or safer to do some sort of work. I would say that for those larger positions, I mean, in general, if you find like the cloud interesting, and you find the idea of working with servers in the cloud just naturally interesting, then it's definitely a worthwhile thing to get into. Like, I just think that it's freaking cool. Our infrastructure, I can hit a button to scale up one of our services to like 100x, and then it'll automatically spin up a bunch of servers to support that. And I just think that's really cool. If you want to, I would say that for smaller companies, you need to already sort of have like an understanding of how, at least like a low level understanding of how the software development process works, or at least I guess a high level understanding of how the software development process works, and sort of like how you would want to be deploying software. And if you find yourself writing code on your machine and running tests, running your linter, pushing code up to GitHub and thinking, wow, this thing, every time that I run this command, it's really annoying that I have to run these next couple of commands. And you are interested in the possibility of how to make it so you just run one command and then it automatically figures out what to do from there. I would say that it's probably a worthwhile field to at least start looking at. If you play around with Docker, if you find Docker cool, if you find Kubernetes conceptually cool, Terraform, I would say that those are some of the really big things. But also, it's sort of the hard part as well, is that like, to get deep experience with this, you need to sort of be at an organization that's already sort of doing it. I think that this is a really hard field to break into at a small company. Like, you are much, much more likely to be able to break into DevOps at a larger company, or at least one that already has a DevOps team existing.
So So I guess I see a lot of not senior engineers, backend engineers that kind of start leaning into that a bit more and start automating a lot more for the backend team. Do you feel like someone that's a backend developer can naturally progress into DevOps if they join another company and their current company doesn't give them that opportunity?
Yeah, I would say that the best example in my career that I've seen of someone breaking into DevOps was the dude who joined me at my previous company. It was just me on the team, and then we went looking to hire someone, and this guy rules. Is one of the best engineers that I've ever worked with. But his progression was he worked as a bank teller and then didn't like that and got into IT and was basically just like doing IT admin or like sysadmin type work, and was reading about was getting frustrated with the things at his job that could be more efficient and could be automated and could be done in a more reliable way, and was learning about those things on his own and trying to implement them at his company on his own, but his company wouldn't really let him. And that is a really, if you want to get a DevOps job and you are interviewing with a team that already exists and you say, I was trying to implement these things, I know how to do it, it would make things so much better, and it's so frustrating that they wouldn't let me, there's nothing that we like to hear more. There's nothing that we'd like to hear more. Yeah. Someone who wants to be proactive and figure out how to make things better and just like intuitively understands, hey, this process that we're doing, it's always the same every time, or like this could easily be automated. I'd say that's one of the better ways to break in, is just gaining that experience automating thing and pushing your company to let you automate things and having good ideas around how to do it.
That's lots interesting.
Research. Yeah.
It sounds like it's tougher to get in if you haven't even landed a dev role yet, if you haven't really gotten that experience on a team and pretty much identified a lot of the problems that could be solved by automating or making the flow a little bit easier. Do you think, honestly, and be candid about this, do you think there's a chance that aspiring developers that haven't gotten tech yet could do that?
I think that getting into I think that you'd be out of your depth at a smaller company. That I think if you have a much smaller team, if you're the only person, if you would be the only person on the DevOps team, you're going to be out of your depth just because you don't know necessarily what a professional software organization would want to be building. But if you are a new developer and like you've not gotten a dev job yet, but you do know how to do software development on your own, and you do, like, if you're working if you're doing hobby development and you can understand some of the software development workflows, like, take the time to go watch some videos on how Docker works. If you can take the time to figure out how Docker works, understand layers, get to the point where you can intuitively understand how file system deltas, and I'm going to use technical terms here because like once you understand what these terms that I'm saying mean, then you can go to companies and try to flex and be like, listen, I know the basics, let me into a junior DevOps role. If you can understand how like file system deltas work, layer caching works, like the basics of how Terraform work, and start playing around with Terraform. That you can do free tier stuff with, like, I think DigitalOcean is probably the easiest bet. If you want to play around with Terraform, DigitalOcean is probably going to be your best bet for at least like deploy a little server. If you can do the path of I push to a GitHub repo, which initiates a GitHub action, which builds my Docker image from the code that I pushes that up to Docker Hub, and then DigitalOcean spins up a server and deploys that image to that server. If you can do all those steps, which I don't think is like, here I am sitting here with 7 years of experience, but I don't think is like really incredibly difficult to do. It's something that if you have no tech experience, no programming experience, will be difficult to do. But if you have a decent amount of programming experience, you can crack that code in like 2 weeks, probably, at least the very basics. And then if you can go to a DevOps position and say, hey, I've done all of this stuff, then, you've proved out enough that you can figure things out on your own, and you can work with the tools that are commonly used in the most basic sense. if I had a junior developer, if we were looking for a junior developer and they were able to show me that they had done all of that, I would immediately, I would leave that meeting and say, we need to hire this person, because it's really hard to find people that can do that.
Yeah, I think that gives people actually a fairly helpful outline. And I think just looking at the Terraform website, I think if your project is open source, it is free. Am I correct in saying that?
Terraform, the tool itself, is free. That's Terraform Cloud that they're talking about. I would recommend just staying away from Terraform Cloud. Honestly, if you're just working on your own private project, don't even necessarily worry about Terraform remote state management. Just run it all locally. And at the very least, like, you can also, here's a way to be lazy and then score bonus points in the interview, which is a very DevOps thing to do. You can, in that interview, say, I know that this state should have been saved remotely, but I just wanted to figure out how to get it to work. And then I'll be like, oh, hell yeah. Going for a little spike, little POC. Ooh, love it. That's what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Okay. That's pretty cool. I don't think I've ever had anyone outline that for me to even understand. I think what you're describing is fairly easy to achieve, especially if that interests you. So for me, I started leaning more in the front end route. I'm finding that I really love back end. And the further I mean, even just some of the problems that we were experiencing when we were managing a lot of big data, I'd kind of poke in with questions and try to figure out how a lot of this is being optimized. This is super interesting. And I've always been fascinated with creating my own pipeline and spinning up a testing environment and something that QA could test in. I wasn't a huge fan of Docker, just because dealing with Docker with multiple operating systems, I just didn't play with it enough to be able to deal with that. But
that stuff is so gross. I don't even use my Windows computer for programming anymore. Yeah.
Oh, really?
I don't even play with it. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's a little bit of a relief, but that is really interesting. I'm fascinated by creating a lot of automations, and I feel like, sometimes when aspiring developers are trying to become developers, for 99% of people, it's build projects. What do you want to build? What do you want to create? Think about even your old industry. Could you have used better software? What would that have looked like? Build it, right? And so a lot of people struggle with this concept of trying to figure out a project, but I do think it's a skill that you can build up. But there are a few people that don't want to build some random project and think about a user for it. Some people want to build developer tools. Some people want to just write tons of tests and just they get this, comfort in just having more confidence that a lot of this code is going to continue to run just as it is. And some people like spinning up a test instance and being able to toss their code in the cloud and test it out. And then, when they are ready, they do emerge and it automatically will build to the server, et cetera. They kind of just creating a little bit more of it automations with that pipeline and that build. So I think this is kind of an interesting path, and it sounds like it's going to be very challenging for someone that doesn't really have a lot of professional tech experience. But if they have that fascination for it and they explore these tools and they get it up and running, even if they don't, hop onto the pricing model for Terraform Cloud, you had mentioned an alternative.
You just run Terraform locally.
Okay, so it sounds like it could be an option if you're really fascinated by it. I'd be curious. I think I'm going to start asking people, because they ask me how did they get into DevOps. I'm going to start asking why. I want to kind of feel why they want to get into DevOps over traditional software engineering. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud, but that's super helpful. Yeah, it is.
For sure.
Do you feel like you go ahead?
It's a weird niche. I find as well that most developers say that they're like, man, thank you for doing that DevOps stuff, because it's a bunch of stuff that I would never want to do. And interestingly enough, when I was in high school and college and looking at software job postings, because I was a cool kid and mostly just very curious, I would see build engineering roles and this sort of stuff and think wow, that sounds miserable. I do not want to do that. And here I am, having done it for 7 years. But yeah, it's a lot of stuff that is sort of weird, and it doesn't really fall in line with the classic dev projects. But it's just man, it's so interesting, and it's also just so satisfying when you see every single developer at your company having their jobs be easier because of tools that you've built. it rules. And you just get to work with cool stuff. I'm like responsible for like $40,000 a month of spending. It's a lot of money, but it's basically, it's just a number now, sort of, but I also get to spin up a bunch of really cool servers and do all this cool stuff. Yeah, it's pretty fun. I dig it.
That's really cool. So talking with, here's something I'm going to challenge you with. Talking with someone that was in DevOps. He's a senior backend engineer, and he kind of just worked with the stack that we've been working with for a very long time. And he was that person that wanted to make it a lot easier for the team and create a lot of automations. He moved into the DevOps role, but he also expressed a concern that his job, he didn't feel super secure about his job, because when he built a lot of this out, he finished it essentially, and the team was happy with it, and he actually wasn't sure what to do next, and he was insecure about that. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I have been there. I actually did get laid off from my previous company because COVID, they're hitting hard times, and DevOps engineers are expensive, and so they just got cut it down to one. So I understand the concern. I would say that, like, I think that it's mostly about continuing to look for what is the next opportunity to optimize things and make things more stable and easier for developers to do. Like going and setting aside time to interview your developers and asking them what are the frustrating things. Honestly, this is something that I've always been too busy with too many projects to do, but this is something that I really think it would be a very worthwhile thing to do, and something that anytime I've done it has been beneficial, which is like, go do development. Go, say, hey, this is a slow week for me. This is a slow month for me. I'm going to go join one of the feature teams and firsthand do development so that I can firsthand see, so you can eat your own dog food and see what's bad. And then, go from there and hopefully have a bunch of ideas around how to improve things from there.
I like that.
Go to conferences as well. That's a really big thing. Yeah. Also, another thing, if you are a new developer and you think DevOps would be an interesting thing to break into, get your company to send you to conferences. Also, just general advice for every developer: get your company to send you to conferences. Look for ones in your city. I've learned so much just from it's like a 40-minute talk that then just changes the way that you look at software development. I think especially earlier on in your career, it's really important to do. And if you can get your company to send you to a DevOps conference or even a more generic conference that does have some DevOps tracks, that's a great way to really start to learn some meaty stuff. And then you can go and talk to, I spoke for my first time at a conference like a month or two ago. And speaking from personal experience, the people up in front talking, they're there to talk to everyone. So if you want to go talk to them right after, they're there to talk to people. Like I was flattered and excited by everyone that wanted to hear more information about the things that I had to say. So yeah, go to conferences, talk to those people. And also, if you're not yet a developer and you don't have a company that will cover the expensive conference tickets, look for tech meetups in your town and see if there are DevOps tech meetups, because you can go there and talk to people in person as well. Anyway, those were very helpful for me.
Yeah, I like that. That's really good advice. If someone wanted to dive into this, they wanted to learn these tools, or even, even get into software engineering and build things that would eventually kind of transition into more of the DevOps area, do you have any courses or coding boot camps, et cetera, that you would recommend?
Unfortunately, not.
Did you read a lot of API documentation to learn a lot of these tools?
Yes. And Terraform, thankfully, has the best documentation I've seen from anything. There are definitely some issues, but in general, the Terraform website has incredible documentation. I'm very much a look at docs, but also primarily just find examples of how other people have done things and then play around with them until I can do the thing that I want to do. And then I'm a big fan of the pattern of look for someone else having done it before, ideally. Take that, do it the way that I want to do it, messy, and then take what I've done and refactor it to be clean and nice. And honestly, there are some good DevOps tutorials out there. Probably, I've not really done too many, but it really is the type of thing where I would say like, yeah, pick a specific thing that you want to do. Like figure out if you Google deploy static web server with Terraform and then like DigitalOcean or AWS or like deploy, probably the easiest thing to do, the easiest first Terraform thing that you can do where you can actually go in your web browser and go to something. Just Google Terraform S3, which is an AWS service for static file hosting. Google Terraform S3 host static website. And you will almost certainly be able to find a guide for how to write Terraform to create an S3 bucket and a URL that you can hit, and then how to upload an HTML file in there. And then bing, bang, boom, you got yourself a little website and you've written some Terraform and you have been created a website in honestly a more responsible way than 90% of websites that exist out there. So, you can pat yourself on the back too.
I like that. It feels like this profession, this area, a lot of people that get into DevOps are just curious people that want to make things more efficient, and they're resourceful. And I feel like this almost helps a lot of people that do really dive deep into the self-taught route and they figure things out. I feel like those people have the potential, if they have the interest, to dive into DevOps a little bit more. Because I haven't really heard of any like strong coding boot camps around this, or people coming out of CS degrees, like going into it directly for DevOps. It feels like it's something you kind of piece together.
Yeah. I think the hard thing is that DevOps is just such a poorly defined term, and there's so much to, what companies are going to expect of you that like, you can't really expect to be taught DevOps in a course or a boot camp just because it is, people don't even know what they're saying when they say DevOps. So like, it really is a thing where I would recommend Googling tutorials for specific things and then figuring out how to chain those things together. Like GitHub Actions, it's just running command line commands. Don't use the built-in actions as much as you can. Only use them occasionally. I'm not a big fan of built-in actions for a bunch of reasons, but mostly because I think like it's way easier to just read someone's shell command and then a little bash file there. Anyway, GitHub Actions just run commands on a server. So like if you're running commands to build a Docker image on your machine, or you're running commands to deploy something to Docker Hub on your machine, well then think like, okay, cool. What are the commands that I would run if I was in a server to do this, which are the same commands you would run on your local machine, because your local machine is a computer and so is the server. And then you write a GitHub action to automate those steps. And so like a lot of this automation for CI is basically just figuring out what are the discrete steps that I want to run, and then how do I chain those together? And a lot of the experience with DevOps is just like, and a lot of the knowledge that you gain is you have the foundation of how to tie things together. And then the experience comes from, okay, now I know nuanced things about AWS subnets, or like now I know about how to deploy a Kubernetes cluster to DigitalOcean, or now I know how to deploy, all the different little components are the things that you'll learn over time. But at least for a new DevOps engineer, what we really, really, really want to see is a fundamental understanding of, I need to chain things together. And here's the basic concept around how to do it. And then most importantly, if you don't know how to do something, Google it and, try to figure it out. And then if you can't figure it out, ask someone. And that's really what I'm looking for in a new DevOps engineer.
I like that. I feel like you did an excellent job at like really articulating your mindset about how you even approach problems, and even just sharing and exposing a lot of your curiosity and how essentially you just wanted to make things just a little bit better. And like that is kind of your mindset as well. You want to help the team out. You want to make your essentially the pipeline of the process a lot better for your other teammates. And it evolved into you diving a little bit deeper into DevOps and solidifying that career track for you. But like, I feel like I've heard what you've said from a few different DevOps. It actually sounds pretty similar, different responsibilities, pretty similar mindset. And I just wanted to bring that onto the podcast. So I'm essentially saying you were very articulate and you did a good job with it. So
thank you. I appreciate that. I've honestly been struggling to explain a lot of these concepts for basically all my career. So I'm glad it could happen here. And thanks for guiding me with the good questions to be able to elaborate. Yeah. Hopefully people find this helpful. I mean, I love the field. we also really need DevOps engineers bad. We really, really do. It's impossible to hire. It's so difficult to hire new DevOps engineers. And so like if automating these things is something that you find interesting and you can get that real basic GitHub action running so that, so that you can push code and then have it deploy to that S3 bucket. I mean, like having people that you can add to your team that understand that basics and then have the curiosity to learn more. Yeah, I hope people have found this helpful because it's such a great field. We need a lot more people, and like it pays really well, and you get to work on interesting and cutting edge things. And like, yeah, it's a good path to go down. So if anyone finds this stuff to be interesting, I'd highly recommend diving into it because it's really fun. You get to work on cool stuff.
That's really cool. Yeah, I'm glad you shared all this. I didn't even know DevOps was starving for DevOps engineers. So
hard. It's so hard.
Okay, yeah. Good to know.
We were looking for 4 months before we found someone. Like it's really difficult. Yeah.
Okay, gives people a little perspective with that. I just realized we got a couple minutes left, so let's go ahead and wrap this up. This is all super helpful, and if you're watching on YouTube, definitely if you have questions, anything like that, leave it in the comments. Or you want to. If I can do more or bring more people from DevOps on to have more conversations about this, if this is helpful, let me know. If you disagree with anything, let me know in the comments. But David, if people want to reach out to you and anything else you want to shout out, where could they reach you?
LinkedIn is probably the best place. I believe I'm David Kirk Jr. on that. David Kirk Senior, my father. Don't contact him. I mean, unless you want to talk, he's a nice guy, but he's a sales guy, so not too much DevOps help. Yeah, search for David Kirk Jr. And search the network, NTWRK, if you need to filter it down further, and you should be able to find me. Feel free to contact me on LinkedIn. Like, I love talking about this stuff, and yeah, I was helped by a bunch of people to get to the point that I'm at now, and I'm very happy to pass the favor along. So yeah, please feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. If you are going to be at the AWS conference in Chicago on August 25th, I'll be there. So please be sure to watch my talk about how to make Docker image build faster. And if you like NASCAR, I have a podcast called The Big One Podcast. So come be our 13th listener, please.
That's awesome. I love meeting other podcasters. That's really cool. Yeah. Okay. I think that's it. I think that's all my questions. Let me know if you found this helpful. But, David, like I said, stick around for a couple minutes. But thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.